Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back to another episode of A Date with Darkness. I'm super excited to be back and talking with you guys about a topic that comes up often, or a question that I get asked often. And that question is, I was in a relationship with a narcissist. Did the narcissist ever really love me? I felt like I was blindsided out of nowhere, and I felt like I poured so much of myself into the relationship. I'm not even sure that this person loved me, especially, towards the end of the relationship where things got really bad and turned really sour, or, there may have been violence, or it may have ended in a high conflict divorce case or custody battle, et cetera, et cetera. And this person did all of these mean and nasty things to me. And so, my question was, a question that I get is, how was I tricked into thinking that someone actually cared about me or loved me? And here's my answer to that question. If you were in a relationship with a narcissist and that relationship was one that was substantial, meaning that, it was an intimate relationship, or that person was your parent or something of the like, there is a really good chance that person did love you. What I will say about love and the feeling, or just what that is, love is interpreted differently for everyone. And love is expressed differently for everyone. And when you're talking about someone who has a pervasive personality or characterological disorder, love isn't viewed the same way that an empathetic person or a healthy, well-adjusted person views love. And, I'm going to talk about two experiences that I've had as a therapist, mental health person for, just over the years, and what I've noticed about people with narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, or antisocial personality disorder. And the folks that I've worked with, I'm going to talk particularly about my experiences and working in both a group home and in the correctional setting, because I've worked a number of years in both, as well as domestic violence. So I've seen all sides of it. And I'll start with the experience in a group home first, where I worked. It was for a facility. It was an emergency residential facility, a group home facility for kids in California. In California, we have group homes that go from, or range from, level 1 to level 14. And the levels are based on behavioral restrictiveness. So, a level 14 group home is typically a locked facility. There's a lot more restrictions and things like that go into it. Whereas a level 1 group home, there's not a lot of behavioral restrictions. There's a lot more freedom. And behaviorally, the kids are much more well-adjusted. Whereas in level 14 is typically where you get children with very severe emotional disturbances. Typically, they may have been in and out of foster care and around several. Typically, when you're in a level 14 group home, that usually means that you've kind of gone all the way up through all of the levels, and behaviorally the lower level group homes could not or were not able to manage your care for whatever reason. These children have typically have severe emotional disturbances. They may have been kicked out of several facilities or kicked out of foster care several times due to, folks or facilities not feeling like, okay, this person needs much more restrictions than what we're able to give to them, because we can't manage their care. They're just that emotionally disturbed, or they're that violent, that we can't have kids like that in our facility. And so I've worked with all of those ranges, and you can imagine by the time a kid is sort of, they're in emergency housing, or they're in emergent group home, or they've been kicked out of like something that's a facility that's very restrictive. You can imagine that they've sort of been around the ringer. They've been through they've seen a lot of things in life, and they've experienced a lot of hardships, because you have to think, like, that these are children that may have been severely neglected, severely abused, severely gone through some severe sexual trauma, or, just been in some situations, and their behavior towards that is that they've reacted out. They've become so extremes in their violence or their moods, that they just can't be housed in situations without very significant restrictions. And again, those restrictions are typically locked facilities. They're typically, you may encounter children that have to be court ordered to be given medications because they now have a very severe mental illness. And so I just kind of want to paint the picture, to you guys of what this looks like in working with children that have these severe restrictions. Just kind of give you an idea of the facility. And so by the time these children come to you, or come to the facility where I worked at, again, they've seen things. They've lived several lives essentially, unfortunately, where they've just, they've seen it all, they've done it all, they've been homeless, they may have encountered prostitution, again, they may have bounced around from foster home to foster home, they may have experienced abuse within the foster home or within the group home system. And so these are children that, for all intents and purposes, they don't really trust anybody. And they don't trust anybody. They're living life in the way that they know how to do it. So if for example, they've been out on the streets for a long time, or they've kind of, have been bouncing between facilities, they first and foremost, they want the basics, which is to get their needs met. They just want to get their needs met because they've seen it all, they've heard it all, and they've done it all. And one of the disorders that these children usually suffer from, in addition to many other disorders, is a disorder that's called reactive attachment disorder. Reactive attachment disorder is very different from attachment theory, in that reactive attachment disorder is an actual mental health disorder, and it's characterized by an extreme lack in sufficient caregiving. So children who have reactive attachment disorder, they've usually experienced extreme abuse or neglect, and they have a pattern of being emotionally withdrawn from their caregivers. So they don't respond to comfort, in that they can have unexplained irritable moods that can just happen on a dime. They could be minimally socially and emotionally responsive, and that they could just basically, essentially, what it looks like is almost like Jekyll and Hyde sometimes. So a child can be extremely close to you one minute, and then they can be they don't want anything to do with you the next minute. And reactive attachment disorder is one of those those conditions that even though I'm kind of talking about it in the clinical sense, it actually can manifest very differently when you see it in person, especially when you're talking about children with severe emotional disturbances. So how that looks when you may be working with a child from a level 14 home is this child can uh, literally want to murder you the night before, just for simply enforcing the rules that it's your bedtime or you can't be on your cell phone past this hour or something like that. Or, these are the rules, you have to follow them. And you can have a child literally trying to attack you. And then the very next day, as a caregiver or someone who's, trying to, administer medication or something like that, they could, talk to you like nothing's happened. Hey, what's up? How are you doing? And be very, very almost charming and just responding to you like, you're just catching up. Your old friends maybe catching up um, without the intimacy or the connectivity, but it's almost like, you're just bonding and catching up. They may even hug you and say, "Oh, I really, really missed you. And, can we play that game that we played before?" And so it could be night and day where, the day before this person wanted nothing to do with you and may have actually tried to attack you, things like that. And so, there's a very inconsistent in how they approach you, and it has nothing to do with you. It's just that these are children that have these, again, extremely abusive and unpredictable backgrounds. And so the way that they show up in the group home situation is that they can also be very extremely unpredictable towards you, but they can also be wanting to connect and bond with you the next minute. So you don't know what you're going to get. And it's like they could switch on a dime in terms of their mood, their personality, and how they feel about you, what they believe about you, or what they perceive the situation to be. They could be fearful one minute, and then they could be extremely charming and wanting to connect the next minute. And again, it's a situation that it's very unpredictable, but you can understand that these children are trying to adjust behaviorally, cognitively to their environment, and they don't really know how to do that. They don't really know how to function in a normal, healthy environment because all they know is instability. And if you have reactive attachment and combine that with some other severe disorder, then you've got a whole lot going on, and you got a situation with a child that actually looks like an adult or can turn into an adult and have an insurmountable amount of strength and can be very dangerous and lethal within a matter of seconds. And so they can be very unpredictable. Another way that this shows up, this instability, in this inconsistent presentation between hating you one second and loving you the next minute is, especially with children, what I've seen in working with children that have these extreme behavioral issues is that, even though they may be in a group home setting, they're maybe their previous foster parents or even their birth parents and or family members may still have permission to get visitation with them if they're in if they're in this group home setting. And so it's very interesting to watch kids, the very same person that they may have been abused by or experienced or were taken out of their custody. Just it's interesting to watch when a child that has maybe been removed from a parent's custody or situation interacts with them because they get very excited, even though this person may have been abusive or extremely neglectful, right? And people like myself that work with these kids get to see all of the effects of that, right? So, for example, you may see a child that kind of hoards food or hides food in their room because their parents didn't feed them, or they fed them sparingly, or they would be gone from the home for days at a time, that it was very unpredictable, when they were going to get food, or when they were, gonna be able to eat again, and so they may hoard food, they may be afraid to go to bed at night, they may have these vicious nightmares, they may attack people, for being, due to paranoia, from having a bad nightmare, or just from some other issue. They may be extremely depressed or moody, or anxious because of the abuse that they've experienced. And so it's very interesting to watch them go from that, or to have those symptoms, and then, their the abusive parent or the abusive family member can still come and visit with them, or maybe take them out for the day, and they get like super excited to bond with that person. They get super excited to go out and spend the day, and they look forward to it all week. And so if that person doesn't show, or, it doesn't go the way that it's planned, the disappointment is immediate, but they typically spend all week preparing for it, calling them to make sure, because they are so excited to connect with a person that may have been extremely abusive towards them. And it's a it's some serious compartmentalization on their part to, just feel overjoyed and really want to still make an attempt to connect with the abusive parent or neglectful parent, and then, on the back end, expose everyone else to, their periods of rage or unpredictability, right? And so you start to see that being demonstrated very early on, even in childhood, this like inconsistency with the people that are actually there to provide care, and also even with them just sort of compartmentalizing and still trying to stay connected to, people that hurt them. But again, that's a prime example of how reactive attachment disorder shows up in children. But you also get to see that sort of splitting, that black and white, the extreme compartmentalization of feelings and emotions, and even traumatic experiences. And even when they kind of go back into it and re-engage with an abusive person, they've compartmentalized that to, and they want to have this great time, and they're willing to give that relationship with the abusive person another shot, time and time again. And so there's some serious compartmentalization. The other way that I've seen children who have been in foster care, and sort of go through all these levels of group homes and hospitalization is, when they have an opportunity, if and when they do have an opportunity to go out of the group home and get adopted, right? And there's children that have been adopted numerous times. They've been in and out of foster care, or they've been in and out of adoption, right? Where, again, if they were in our facility, that means that they've been through, they pretty much have been around. But oftentimes in talking with with these children, one of the things that I noticed that they've experienced is they had a previous experience of being sexually abused or molested, maybe in a prior setting that they were in. But again, they were willing to compartmentalize that, and kind of, you know, they were able to verbalize that that was something that they would compartmentalize in an effort to try to have a sense of stability. It's like, oh, I may be going through this in this home setting that I'm in, but when I think about, being in the system of the group home versus the home setting, I'd rather endure this than go back into a system. And so they're sort of running on survival defenses of, a terrible situation and a tough situation. And they've evaluated the situations based on survival instincts, and they compartmentalized, um, two tough situations. And they say, this is better than being in the system, even though it's not a great situation. I know how to survive this. And so again, running on survival mechanisms, again, that sort of adds to the pathology of abuse and that splitting and that compartmentalization of surviving in situations that aren't great or that are unstable or that are chaotic or that have been abusive to them. And so they have to essentially say, you know, which system is best for me right now? What is going to best suit my needs right now? And while it is true that, yes, they are still children, they've learned very early on how to survive the toughest of situations. And so it's almost like when you talk to them, you almost feel like you're talking to a mature adult that has lived life, just because they've seen so much and they've had so many experiences and they've had to grow up, unfortunately, very, very quickly. And so that's an example of how you could see that, where they could share these things with you, but they can also compartmentalize, but they can also act out their frustrations, and anger and violence towards you. But at the same time, on another day, or the very next day, or even within the same day, they could be talking with you, wanting to spend time with you, wanting to watch television and everything like that. So they've learned to sort of almost, they attempt to self-regulate by making themselves fit to a situation, kind of like a chameleon, if you will. And in the second instance, I've talked a lot about my experience in corrections on this podcast. And in corrections, again, you get these extreme personalities. And one of the things that I've learned about, working with inmates over the years is that their ability to express gratitude, their ability to connect with you is going to be very different, especially when you're talking about working with inmates with extreme personality disorders, because you have some in there that you work with that don't really have a personality disorder, but they like to say that they do, just so that they could get the benefits of being in a mental health system, right? And not having to do time in a much tougher system, versus the ones that actually do have mental health issues. And here's some of the things that stand out, in terms of working with inmates. And this is their way of sort of expressing connection or feeling something for you in the relationship. Even though I'm in a professional, like I work in a professional capacity with inmates or what have you, um, there's still the ability to connect in a therapeutic sense, right? Because you have to be able to connect with your clients, or ideally you want to be able to connect with your clients to get them to open up, get them to improve their emotional state, and get them to improve their quality of life, even within a system like prison, right? And so here's a couple of the ways that I notice, that both inmates and children, that you could really tell that they value you in a relationship. One is that they want the validation from you, right? They're looking for you to tell them that they're doing a good job. They're looking for you to give them affirmation and confirmation, and to challenge them. And one of the things that I will say, and how I will preface this, is that even though it's in a prison system, right? In a prison system, and the is a controlled environment. So you have a lot of different factors going on in a controlled environment. And one of those things is that typically when you're working in a controlled environment, at least I'll talk about the California prison system, because that is the one that I'm familiar with. The inmates don't usually typically get the luxury of just sort of working with anyone that they want to. Sometimes they may get a chance to change the person that they're working with, but they don't get the luxury. It could be difficult for them to change that the person that they're working with in the clinical sense. And so, with that being said, you typically want to try and work together as best as you can. And the same thing for the children that came to the facility where I worked at is like children that came to that facility. They really couldn't go anywhere else by the time that they came to that facility, or their options were very limited due to the behavioral restrictions that were placed on them at that point. And so, that's the caveat that I'll put on that. But again, going back to number one, what they're going to look for is they're going to look for that emotional validation. And they do want some sense of safety within the relationship, right? And so if you can provide that for them, they feel a lot more at ease talking with you or doing any sort of real therapeutic work with you. Number two, one of the things that I've noticed about narcissists, especially folks with narcissistic personality disorder, based on where they're at in the spectrum, if they have moderate personality traits or features, low to moderate, there's a lot more chance to be successful in working with them versus if they're high up on the spectrum of narcissism. If you're high up on the spectrum of narcissism or even antisocial personality disorder, or you're sadist, or you're what they call a malignant narcissist, it's very difficult clinically and relationally to do any type of work or have any real relationship with a person like that. But, with the folks that are low to moderate, or depending on what their symptoms were, a lot of times they look for stabilization within the relationship. Folks that I worked with, of course, by the time they got to corrections, they're very impulsive. They have done a number of things. They've done a number of crimes. They've harmed people in other ways. And so, again, working with them in a setting. But even as I think on it, like other relationships too, with narcissistic people, they look to you to stabilize them. It's not a mistake that a person, when you're out in the real world and you're in a relationship with a narcissist, it's not a mistake that they chose to be with someone like you. Um, Narcissistic people often look for stable people. They may ghost you, they may act out, they may create conflict and instability in the relationship, but this is one of the reasons why they always come back to you when you're in a relationship with them, even after they've ghosted you for months or years or things like that. They come back to you because they know that you're a source of stability. And so you stabilize them when they're in a relationship with you. Um, and unfortunately, the mistake that often gets made in a relationship with a narcissist is that we expect them to be a stable person, but really you're the stabilizing factor, and you actually have more of the control in the relationship because you're stable and they know that. And stability is not something, especially if they came from an extremely abusive environment, or they grew up at they grew up in an abusive childhood. Stability is not something that they know how to deal with. It's something that they crave and they wish that they could function in, and they know that that's safer and better for them, but it's not necessarily something that they have the skills to work with. Even when it's placed in their hands, they don't know how to work with or be with a stable person in an unstable relationship. They could, and so they may show that they may appear to for a little while, but they're not able to maintain that consistency, that reliability over time, because you're the stabilizing factor. And so they'll latch on to that, and then they'll kind of, go inward and deal with, and wrestle with their own anxieties, their own fears, their own self-hatred, self-loathing, and self-destructiveness. And then they'll act out and they'll bounce out of the relationship. But typically they always try to come back, and usually they try to come back repetitively. And even if they're gone, let's just say they leave you, they ghost you or whatever, typically they still monitor you. So they might monitor your social media, and they may still try to keep watch. They may ride by your house and stalk you for some time just to make sure you're not with anyone else. Because again, they know that you are a stable person. And that's something that they don't want to lose, even if they choose to voluntarily walk away from the situation. Because deep down, they know that. They're not going to necessarily tell you that, but they know that. And so that's one way of them expressing love and connection. They look to you for social cues. So a lot of what narcissists do is they mirror or mimic you. So it's not uncommon after you've been in a relationship with a narcissistic person that they take on your personality traits, or they sort of inherently take on everything that you like and that you embodied, and now that becomes theirs too. So for example, you may like a favorite, you know, you may have a favorite artist that they knew nothing about, and perhaps you introduced them to that, and now that's their favorite artist too. You may have introduced them to certain types of cuisine or a certain lifestyle that they knew nothing about, and now they take on that lifestyle. They inherit that from you, and so they look to you for social and personality cues, and they actually take your identity and incorporate that into their identity. So that's another reason, or another way that you know that they like you. You help to emotionally regulate them to a certain degree. And while you may feel like you don't, because they may show up eventually in the relationship as chaotic, what they are like without you is much worse than they are with you, right? And so even when they're with someone else, again, they can't be consistent in how they show up. But, narcissistic people, although they may like to be alone, or they may not have close relationships, this is what I'll say, they don't have close relationships or friendships. They actually spiral a lot of the times when they're by themselves into a cycle of self-destructiveness, risk. And the way that this shows up when they spiral into the cycle of self-destructiveness, they may engage in behaviors such as cutting. They may drive recklessly. They may engage in risky sexual behaviors or sexually deviant behaviors, things to kind of try to help them regulate. So they may engage in substance abuse and other things like that, gambling, pornography, all the things to try to keep themselves self-regulated and to not deal with being alone. Third, what I've noticed is that, in my time in working with inmates and even children too, is that they definitely attempt to be controlling of you, right? And so part of how that shows up, in working with, for example, with inmates, and a lot of times, especially working with male inmates, they get very, very jealous. So they might try to control, like, oh, I don't want you talking to another inmate on your caseload. So if you have a caseload of 10 men that you're working with, I don't like it when you talk to him. You don't need to talk to him. Or I timed it on my watch and you were actually counseling that guy for 35 minutes instead of 30 minutes, which was longer than my session. So I feel like something's inappropriate. Something inappropriate is going on there, and I don't like that, and I'm going to report you, right? So it's like they try to, they're attempting to control. They're being very protective. And I remember, when I worked in the prison system, sometimes, I would have a caseload, but then what happens sometimes is that people that weren't on my caseload, let's say they had another clinician assigned to them, they had another therapist or psychologist that they were working with. A lot of times they would, even though I wasn't the person that they were working with, they would come up and ask me questions. And so whenever they would come up and try to ask me a question, about such and such or whatever, the guys that I'm working with get intensely angry about that. And they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. They don't need to be talking to you and you don't need to be talking to them. And so they kind of develop the system where like, okay, you don't need to go and talk to Dr. Jones unless that goes through me. And then I will ask her whatever it is you need. And so they become intensely protective and they try to control the protective, possessive, and they try to control, like they don't want anyone to have access to you. And along the lines of that, in terms of not having access to you, they kind of they don't want you to they don't want anyone to like you. And so one of the things that I've noticed is that, some of the folks on the, again, some of my clients that I worked with would talk poorly about me. And the reason that they would talk poorly about me and sort of, try to get out there and spread the word, even though they would come to their appointments, and, they enjoy talking with me, they would try to talk poorly about me so that, again, that they could try to have me all to themselves. Again, this is how they're thinking, like, okay, if I talk poorly about Dr. Jones, no one else is going to want to work with her. And so then I get to have her all to myself and she doesn't get to work with anyone but me. And so that is the thinking behind that. Again, it's very sort of, immature, but it's kind of like, a mild way of putting it. It's like, again, and this kind of goes back to the smear campaign. It's like, when you think about a narcissist doing a smear campaign, it's usually because they're fearful, right? And the fearfulness could be that other people like you better, other people want to maybe be with you, or what have you. So you may have these situations in where they're deliberately trying to smear and make it so that you're unattractive to everyone else. But the proof is in the pudding, right? If they show up and continue coming to, therapy or what have you, but they just don't want anybody else to like you, right? And it's that selfishness that they want to keep you all to themselves. If you have a discussion, and even if they don't hear you, or it seems like they don't hear you, meaning that they might be present for the conversation, but maybe they're not responsive, maybe they're not engaging, and it seems like what you said goes through one ear and out the other. A lot of times what will happen is, even though you don't think they listened to it, or they kind of threw what you said to the side, oftentimes they'll come back and like randomly throw out what you said, right? And they may even take it out of context, but they randomly throw out something that you said and how, oh, I thought about, what you said. And it's typically in a moment of anger, or when they're trying to say something and twist it and use it against you. And you didn't even think that they took that in, but they now all of a sudden they pull that out of the black hat, and it just came out of nowhere, and they just thought about it. And now, you might not have even heard anything about it for a year or two, but they have this razor sharp memory, right? Or they use things that you say, or they bring back up things that you say in the oddest of moments. And that means that they really, like, even if they don't show it, they listen to you. And so again, that's their way of kind of incorporating, or that's their way again of connecting, right? Even if they don't take anything that you say or whatever you say, they take it out of context. If they held on to it, despite that destructiveness, they'll hold on to these things and they'll rerun these narratives in their minds over and over and over again, days, months, years after you've said it to them, long after you may have forgotten it, but they will still hold on to something for a long time. And even if they've moved on to somebody else, they still think about these things. And so a lot of times people think that, narcissists move on and that, even though they may have discarded them, that they're forgotten about, like, oh, you never cared about me. But one of the things that I've noticed through the work that I've done with both children and inmate adult patients is that a lot of times they perseverate on people, they perseverate on events, and things that have happened to them. And even though they may have been dismissed it, or they may not have been appreciative, or they may have acted out um, and destroyed that time, they still perseverate on, and just kind of run that narrative over and that script over in their mind over and over again. And they may actually wish and think about, like, oh, I wish we could have a do-over. I wish I could see that person again. Or I just think about that time, and that, that makes me feel good just thinking about that time that we did X, Y, and Z. And again, you could have been over a long time ago and things could have been done, but they're still sort of thinking about it, romanticizing it and playing it over and over again. So that's another way to know that they connect with you. Um, Obsessiveness. So I think I mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again. It's like, again, usually even after the relationship is gone and done and over with, right? They are obsessed with you, right? And they want to know what you're doing. And again, I think I talked about this on the podcast that I did with Telsa, where she was like, "Oh, narcissists forget and move on," and I was like, "No, Telsa, they don't. They actually, they never forget, and they will actually think about you for many years on, and at night, whatever." Um, you'll still kind of be on their mind again long after the fact. And this is, when people talk about, oh, the narcissist left and then they suddenly reappear years later. And they reappear years later because they've obsessed over you the entire time, that you were no longer a part of their lives, or, you weren't in each other's lives, or even though the relationship may have seemed to be done, they actually obsessed over you the entire time, right? And so they've been watching, they've been monitoring social media, they've been, maybe driving by your home, seeing what you're up to, wanting to stay connected, right? And so those are, um, some of the ways there. Even when you're discarding, when a narcissist discards you, prior to the discard, they feel very, very anxious, right? And so discard is actually, even though it may seem easy, it's usually something that they think about for a while. It's something that they start preparing for mentally, prior to actually doing that. And so, but doing that process, they feel anxious. They feel anxious before they actually do it, and then they may feel relief when they do it. But again, that anxiety comes back. And they start to feel anxious. They start to think about, did I act too impulsively? What did I do? Um, the grass may not be greener. I know that this person was good for me. And then I may have sort of spiraled out of control and, went and had all these other different relationships with people. But now I want to have that back, and I acted too impulsively. And they kind of ruminate on, making a mistake, or feeling like they've made a mistake, or wanting to reach back out. And so again, that leads back into the obsessiveness that I just got done talking about. And so disconnection from you makes them feel anxious, and they actually think about it quite a bit, and they go back and they go back and they go back and they keep going back over it to see, I don't know if this is the right decision. I don't know, I kind of want to still be connected to that person because that person provided a need for me. That person stabilized me in this way. but then this person doesn't. And they know that, a lot of times the behavior can be impulsive. Again, and this depends on the type of narcissistic person that you're dealing with, but the behavior can be impulsive. And a lot of times they think about a do-over, or how can I correct, or how can I get back into this situation. That's why when they come back from a discard, right? When they come back after a discard, they're not very well self-regulated, and that's why when they come back to you, you're actually much more in control than they are, because again, they're kind of spiraling at this point. They're sort of circling the drain, and they're coming back, and they hate the feeling that they have of like feeling like, oh shoot, I needed this person. I like this person in a way, but I don't want to connect with that emotion. And I actually hate feeling like I need this person, or I'm dependent on this person, or that I have some sort of um emotional feeling about this person, right? And so they hate it, but at the same time, they want very much to be connected with you. And they hate the fact that they don't like being vulnerable, or you even interpreting their behavior as being vulnerable in some way. And so they want to try to avoid that. Nevertheless, albeit as tough as it is for them to kind of come back to you, they'll still do it. Okay. And again, I kind of went over the obsession and things like that, but one example that I would give, I don't know if you've ever watched the movie The Color Purple, which I personally don't like the movie, but if you've ever watched The Color Purple, you remember that Celie went through all the stuff with her husband, and he was extremely abusive towards her, and then she left him and kind of had this life down the street or wherever. And he had, throughout the course of their marriage, he had done everything to keep her apart from her sister, because he couldn't have sex with her sister, or he felt like he couldn't have. He couldn't have sex with her sister and pursue her in the way that he wanted, and so he was malicious in keeping her separate from her sister, and just being an abusive husband overall. But at the end of the movie, he like took the steps to kind of help her reconnect with her sisters and her children and all of that, and helping them go through immigration and everything, and coming back to the United States. And I bring that up to emphasize that, again, although you may never hear about it, there is, when you're in a relationship with a narcissist, or if you've been in a relationship with a narcissist, there is often times where they sort of sit back and they replay things and how they turned out. Again, it depends on the type of narcissist, but they may replay and think about things, and oftentimes they will wish that they were back in that situation. And they're kind of like, you can hear them, and I've often seen them because I've often also worked in rehabilitation facilities where I've seen older people like grow old alone, or, be in their, have their last days where they're alone. And a lot of times they'll wish for something or someone back in their lives, and they can't fathom or understand why they're not there, or at least they express it that way. But at the same time, it's like, oh, I long to be connected to this person, or things could be different, or they wish that this person was here, but they might never say it in that way. But they long for that connection and that relationship. But they don't allow themselves to get vulnerable, to say it in a way that's like, oh, I love you, I'm sorry I made a mistake. No, but they will sort of, again, obsess and ruminate, and play that narrative over and over. And just think about that. And that would happen a lot with children too. It's like, oh my gosh, I missed you and I wish you were here. Children are better about it than adults are, because the children, again, with the splitting and the reactive attachment, even though they were violent, they oftentimes would come up the next day and it would be very extreme, hot and cold. one day they'd be trying to hurt you, fight you, whatever, and the next day they're literally hugging you, saying, "I missed you. I want us to go shopping. Can we play that board game? Would you cook this X, Y, and Z breakfast? I really enjoyed this and that and the other thing." And so you will get to see a lot of that extreme vacillation there. And so I hope that this has made sense, to just kind of paint the picture that narcissistic people are capable of having feelings. They are capable of having empathy, but they don't allow themselves to express that. And one of the things that, especially when you're talking about narcissism that's due to trauma, because I do feel like a fair amount of narcissistic personality and as well as other personality disorders may be due to trauma in the home or in their childhood upbringing. Not always, but most of the time I think it is that you have to realize in that working with folks like this, when they've learned very early on that when they've expressed emotions such as vulnerability, trust, um, hopefulness, in their caregivers or the people that they've trusted to kind of take care of them, or people that they were conditioned to be around at a very young age. They were oftentimes hurt by these people, in a number of ways. They could have been sexually traumatized. They could have experienced neglect, physical abuse, whatever types of abuse you can imagine. And so they've learned very early on that, if that these feelings, connection, intimacy, vulnerability, expressing hurt, and things like that. Those types of feelings can get you hurt and can make you to the wrong person. The wrong person will perceive you to be weak. A wrong person will perceive you to be a person that they need to victimize. And so they've learned that early on. And so the way that they can cope and adapt and adjust to this, is saying that I don't ever want to be the person that's weak anymore. I always have to be in control. I always want to make sure that I have the upper hand and that no one's ever going to hurt me. And so I will be the one who's destructive. I will be the one who's in control. And so they want to make sure that this is their way of coping and trying to make sure that they have the upper hand. However, they don't have healthy coping skills. They don't have the ability to necessarily say, these are my boundaries and that's what it is. Or they don't have the coping skills to necessarily implement boundaries. And a lot of times, narcissistic people, although they're trying to stabilize and regulate, they still struggle with stability and chaos, which is oftentimes why you will see a narcissistic person go from a stable person like yourself and go back into a chaotic, risky situation that is totally opposite, right? Or the rebound relationship, or you may see them do these extreme behaviors because the struggle is between what's good for me, like I don't know how to do what's good for me, versus doing what I know, right? And so that therein lies the struggle. So, just as a last thought, if you've ever wondered if they ever loved you in the relationship, the love might not have been based on the same values as yours. They don't necessarily define love the way that you do, perhaps. But again, when you're basing love off of what you've experienced, and what and it can be distorted by years of abuse and trauma and survivalism. They may not have the love that they demonstrated and showed you, or that they were trying to have with you, wasn't based on your values and your definition, but they most likely were attached to you in a way that makes sense for them. a disorganized way. They may have been connected to you, and they do remain somewhat connected and hold on to you, maybe long after the relationship is gone. And a lot of times, even though you may not think that, you may have moved on or the relationship didn't end in good terms, they do still hold on to that for you, and not necessarily in the healthiest way either. Um, but again, know that it did mean something to them. That should not change how you move and how you operate in the relationship. Think the question for you should be, did I show up fully as myself? Did I express love in a way that was healthy for me? Did I attach in a healthy way, and did I detach in a healthy way? And what did this relationship teach me? The important thing to remember is for you going forward, how do you define love? How do you view love? And how do you want people to love you going forward? And have you made that clear? And do you show yourself that every day in every way in your actions and what you do, in how you treat yourself, how you speak to yourself? So until next time, you guys take care of yourselves and be well. Bye for now.